Welcome to After the Freeze, What's Next for New York City Housing, presented by Vital City, which seeks to improve civic life by finding great ideas and innovative research and making them available and understandable to those who shape urban policy. I'm Errol Lewis, political anchor at Spectrum News New York One, and I'm a contributing writer for Vital City. And we are glad to have a chance to talk about this important issue right after it became newly relevant following last night's vote of the Rent Guidelines Board. I'll be talking for the next hour with some great and interesting people who have some great and interesting things to say. What we'll do is talk for a bit, and then we'll invite you all to join by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Joining us this morning are Arpit Gupta. He is a Rent Guidelines Board member and an associate professor of finance at NYU Stern. Michelle De La Uz is the executive director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, a nonprofit community development corporation that develops, preserves, and manages affordable housing and community facilities. Howard Slatkin is executive director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, a research and policy organization that focuses on housing, zoning, and neighborhood planning across the 5 boroughs. Welcome, folks. Thank you all so much for joining us. I want to jump right in with you, Mr. Gupta, because you were, as they say, in the room where it happened. What was it like being at that fairly raucous hearing last night?
It's similar to what it's like every year, to be honest, especially the final vote. We have hundreds of people in the room. That venue was at capacity. So the owner member was sitting next to me who made a prepared statement. I could not hear a word of what he was saying, sitting, 1 foot away from me. So it's a very raucous moment, and I understand it's a great experience for many tenants. So I appreciate the energy in the room that everyone brings out to this process.
Does the board meet and or have discussions between hearings, between these public hearings?
We do, and the thing is, there's a requirement that any discussion involving 5 or more individuals be reported to the public. So we have a lot of discussions involving 4 or fewer people.
And I guess one last sort of scene type question. Has it occurred to the chair of the board that they could keep order in the room at some of these hearings?
I can't speak for the chair or the past chairs. I imagine the thought has occurred to them, but it is a very challenging process to find a way of doing so while respecting the democratic process and the rights of people for free assembly and speech.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's get into the substance then. So, what's your understanding as a board member of the legal requirement to balance data and other factors, including the overall economy and, frankly, tenants' ability to pay, affordability concerns, against the hard data about the cost of operating a rent stabilized building?
Yeah, we have a very broad mandate in the sense that the initial mandate creating the board set out 3 basic requirements for us to look at. So the first of these kind of pertains to building conditions, housing conditions, things like that. The second relates to cost of living requirements. And the third is just other data, such as the board wants. So even the conventional understanding of the framing of what the RGB does, which is to balance affordability issues for tenants against building cost pressures for owners, even that is sort of interpreted from the statute, kind of primarily from the third leg of the mandate, as well as something from the cost of living indices. So the statute doesn't really give us that much to work on, and hence understanding is that courts have interpreted quite liberally the ability for boards such as ours to interpret the data and balance the competing interests that we're trying to serve.
Okay. So now, Michelle, let me ask you in your capacity as a longtime builder and operator of affordable housing, from your point of view, what have the costs been like in recent years? We keep hearing very much from the apartment association and other landlord associations that the expenses have been skyrocketing while the rents have not. What, from your point of view, is the situation like these days?
Thanks for having me. I mean, there's no question that the costs of owning and operating housing, including affordable housing, they certainly have gone up for us. In particular, insurance costs, we've heard a lot about that, have gone up, anywhere from 25% to, over 200% increases. It kind of depends. And there's some concern that they're going up even higher in 100% affordable housing projects. Um, so it's very real. Obviously, water and sewer rates have also gone up. So that's been our experience.
And to the extent that we now have this freeze in place, how will it affect your ability to do your work? Do you have buildings that will be affected by the freeze?
We do. I mean, the relationship, tenants need housing, tenants need affordable housing, and owners need rents in order to pay the bills associated with maintaining the properties. I think the challenge we're in is that, people's incomes have not kept pace with the cost of living. We definitely have properties that will be challenged and are quite honestly have already been challenged in terms of being able to pay our mortgages that we have. And all of our properties, just, to provide a little context, all of them, in addition to our units being rent regulated, they're also under regulatory agreement with the city or state of New York. So we kind of have a belt and suspenders approach to ensuring affordability for our tenants, and all of our tenants are low and moderate income. And so, any increase in rent is definitely a challenge especially for low and moderate income tenants. But all of our properties are underwritten by government to have, revenue, i.e. rents increase and by 2% a year, and to have expenses anticipated to be underwritten to increase 3% a year. And we've definitely seen expenses go, definitely more than 3%, certain expenses, obviously, as I just mentioned, even more so. But rents, the revenue side has, especially with this rent freeze, will be flat. That being said, we understand why our tenants can't support paying more rent. And we know there needs to be another public policy solution to help address our other cost needs as owners.
Right. Oh, yeah. We definitely are going to get to that. But in the short term, after a vote like yesterday, do you now contact the city and say, "Listen, the assumptions under which we struck our
We've
agreement
already
have now
contacted the
changed"?
city. They already know. Yeah, they know. We've
Okay.
been contacting the city for well over a year.
Well, I mean, but seriously, what do they say? I mean, because much of the impetus for last night's vote came from City Hall.
Yeah, and they knew this going in, and I think they recognize the strain that this is going to place, especially on those of us who, own 100% affordable housing for low-income tenants. They launched something just recently called Tools, which is, their whole set of new programs, if you will, new efforts to help owners and managers of affordable housing to basically address some of the gaps that exist, not just because of the RGB vote, but because of other strains that are going beyond the RGB vote and the inability to raise rents. I mean, even absent the increasing, of rents, we've had tenants who are falling behind, especially since COVID. We have higher arrears rates than we used to have. Housing court is taking longer, so it takes longer to resolve these things. There's a backlog of processing, city FEPs at the city's HRA office. And meanwhile, it's not like our lenders don't expect to be paid their mortgages, and Con Ed and National Grid expect to be paid, DEP expects to be paid, and of course our insurance providers all expect to be paid and must be paid. So if you don't want to default, and so
Right.
and we're obviously committed to preserving our affordable housing in perpetuity.
I see. So now, Howard Slatkin, the effort to sort of balance all of the different competing needs and make sure that we have a stable, if not expanding, stock of affordable housing is a project you spent a lot of time thinking about. How important is it to make a distinction between what are considered good landlords and quote unquote bad landlords? Meaning, are the motivations as important as the market forces?
Well, I think the outcomes are really what's important. In the goal that we should be having for the responsibility of landlords is to deliver quality, sound, well-maintained housing for the residents, which is what we all think residents deserve. The challenge is that they have different pools of resources from which to do that. And so one of the things I've said in the past is that a good landlord who's broke can't really be a good landlord, right? You can have all the good intentions in the world, but if you don't have the resources that you need in order to deliver the maintenance and services that the building and the residents need, you're not going to be a good landlord to those tenants, and despite all those good intentions. And the thing that we like to highlight is that rent is two things, and we have to be aware of them both at the same time. And I have to say, the RGB process is kind of the opposite of being able to do both things. It's basically an either or decision that in many ways that the RGB confronts. But rent is an expense for tenants. It's like the biggest household expense for most renters in New York City. But it's also the primary source of operating revenue for the buildings they live in. So when you shortchange that, it comes back to tenants too, right? Like the tenants are living in the consequences of whether their buildings are adequately funded or not. And that's what makes it really important to get this policy and set of policies right.
Is the issue that the rent is due every 30 days, but the effects of an underfunded building won't be felt for months and possibly even years?
Well, I mean, that's certainly part of it. Sometimes the effects are felt more quickly than that. One of the things that you can see in the data that some of the portfolio managers have shared is that because of all the bills that Michelle just ran through, all the bills that an owner has to pay, it's not optional to pay your utility bills, your taxes, your mortgage, and all those other bills. The thing that ends up getting shortchanged is the actual physical investment in the buildings. Especially the non-emergency things that could be put off for a little while. And those things will pile up and they will turn into bigger bills down the road. One of the data points that I think is really instructive is that the Community Preservation Corporation put out a brief on their rent stabilized portfolio in New York. And they found that operating expenses increased over 5 years by 27%, rents had only increased by 11%. And every category of operating expense had increased except one, which was repairs and maintenance. And that is a really worrisome thing to see because it means that by taking care of all the non-optional obligations, some things that really shouldn't be optional are starting to become optional for people who are managing affordable buildings.
Well, look, Michelle, ultimately the HPD inspectors will come knocking, right? Maintenance ultimately is not optional, right?
That's right. We have an obligation to provide habitable apartments and habitable properties. And so it is not optional, which is, I think what Howard's talking about, there's no question that it may, you might take longer to get that extra bid, to find that, that vendor who's willing to do the same work for less. You might stretch it out a little bit longer, kind of a thing. Obviously, that's not something we want to do as an owner. And we avoid doing for sure. But there is a reality, and which is why owners of affordable housing that are regulated, not just stabilized, for more than a year. So we're talking prior administration, even when the RGB was voting for increases. Like we were seeing expenses go up at such an alarming rate, and we were seeing rent collections not at what they had historically been, that we've been alarmed, right, as owners. Like there's like an existential crisis going on the affordable housing side of things. Like the city of New York, from a public policy perspective, has invested billions of dollars into affordable housing for low and moderate income tenants. And, we don't pay property taxes, right, for our regulated housing stocks, separate from the, for-profit owned rent stabilized stock. And we've been saying for a while, we're not on a good trajectory here. Like if we don't invest in this housing stock, not only will the housing stock suffer, but our tenants will suffer. And the investment that the city of New York has made into these properties for decades, for generations, is at risk. And the entire vision that we all share of an inclusive city where like people of all races and all incomes can, survive and thrive is at risk. So we definitely need to come up with a variety of public policy solutions. That being said, like we know tenants right now, especially low and moderate income tenants, cannot afford more. They are at a breaking point. And when you add on top of that, what's going on with, cuts to SNAP and cuts to Medicaid and additional requirements there, like, there really is a breaking point. And I think that's why you saw the fervor, that you saw. Like this is potentially life or death, or certainly survival for, for tenants living in rent stabilized housing across the city.
Arpit, I've never been to Mumbai, but it is cited as an example of a worst case scenario, and it's from more than half a century ago, or but explain a little bit about, from an economist's point of view, what the nightmare scenario that we want to avoid looks like, using that as an example.
Let me take an example even closer to home, which is under the administrations in the 70s and 80s, when we had massive distress in our rent stabilized segment here, right? So we saw the Bronx burning down. We saw widespread distress among housing owners in the city. And this is true for a variety of reasons. We saw declines in housing value, and we saw the beginnings of rent stabilization in this period. And this ultimately led to the control of about 100,000 units through in-rem foreclosure to the city of New York, which is basically because the buildings were unable to generate revenues in order to pay the taxes. Lately, it's been more commonly done through tax lien sales, if a building is not able to afford its tax payments. But in that period, the administration took under 100,000 housing units that were unaffordable to be operated by private owners into the hands of the government, with the intention of this being affordable housing provided by the city. And I think the conventional wisdom is that didn't go very well. So if we're talking about the negative or bad scenario here, I think the worry is pretty tangible. You have, as Michelle is saying quite eloquently, cap and freeze on the revenue that you can bring in. The costs, meanwhile, are not capped. This whole system is quite frustrating to be in the center of, because it's pitched as sort of owner versus renter or so forth. But the reality is the government is there in the background controlling all of it. The government controls the insurance system. It controls the insurance regulations, which lead to high amounts of liability issues that are causing lawsuits that are spiking the insurance rates. The government controls the property taxes, which Michelle doesn't have to pay in her units, but account for about 31% of the expenses of rent stabilized buildings overall. And the Furman Center has done great work highlighting the inequitable burden that those property taxes fall on rental housing in general and rent stabilized housing in particular. You have the water board, which has been mentioned, which is government controlled, and also sets. So the government controls all the costs, or many of the costs that building owners face. And yet they put this board, and then they give us some mandate to translate these government set costs onto burdens for the tenants, and we get kind of caught in the middle. So the cost, again, I think, is that if the board sets the rental adjustments in such a way and the government does not control the costs, that the costs are going to keep rising, that revenues are frozen, and that will lead to inevitably a number of these buildings being uneven. So it starts, as Howard was saying, with deferred maintenance. And again, the Furman Center has highlighted that we are already seeing the beginnings of deferred maintenance in some buildings. This leads to violations issues. This leads to problems in building conditions that in the short run, HPD can try to address, but will really kind of continue from there. Then you have failures to pay the lenders, and the nonprofit lenders tell us that maybe a third of rent stabilized buildings in their portfolio currently do not have the cash flow necessary to pay their mortgages. They're dipping into reserves and things like that in order to try to do so in the short term. But once those run out, they'll be unable to pay for the buildings. The buildings will go into distress and foreclosure. And then ultimately, when the property tax doesn't get paid, now it's on the hands of the government to decide what to do with it. And that will lead to either government control, as you saw kind of in the 80s, or tax lien sales and so forth. And this does lead to different landlords. The type of landlords that are not buying rent stabilized buildings or would be the new purchasers are, I do worry they're not going to be the same type of landlord that we've had in the past. Once you're dealing with these properties, you might have much more extractive landlords or different landlords. So there are, I think, real tangible concerns about what is the future of rent stabilized housing in a scenario in which you have this capped revenues and kind of uncapped costs.
Well, it's interesting. You say the government, but ultimately, this new city government was voted in by the people. So ultimately, as is often the case in a democracy, we kind of have to all look at each other and take some responsibility for all of this. And Arpit, you cast the only dissenting or no vote last night, even taking into account what you just said. What were you trying to convey with that vote?
I wasn't trying to convey anything, but we have a mandate on the board to try to execute on, as it's been interpreted, a balance of interests between competing factions. And so I'm just trying to do my best job in public service to try to make what I think is the best decision in the interest of the public, which I represent as a public member. And look, I would be totally in favor of a rent freeze if it came under conditions that warranted it. I think this is not popularly known, but under the rent freezes that we had under the de Blasio administration, those happened either under conditions of COVID, which is such an extraordinary situation that warranted a rent freeze, or in one of the other earlier rent freezes, the commensurates that the board looks at in order to determine price changes over time was actually negative, i.e. prices were falling in the period when the board executed the rent freeze. So in that sense, the freeze was actually like a positive adjustment relative to building costs and considerations, primarily because in that period, energy costs were actually declining. So rent freezes, even rent rollbacks, are completely within, in my view, the mandate and judgment of the board if those costs are under control. And again, like the city can actually control a lot of these costs. So it's totally up to the administration to say, hey, we're cutting property taxes, we're going to cap insurance expenses as they have certain plans to do in ways that would justify the board's decision to freeze rents or lower rents. But the data we were presented with this year was one in which these efforts to try to contain these costs were still incomplete. And the cost picture that we're looking at for landlords is quite high. We're looking at very high cost increases, in all these categories that landlords are dealing with. So to freeze rents in a condition where these costs are going quite high presents a challenge. I certainly acknowledge, as Michelle pointed out, that the tenants also experience substantial financial hardships. It's no easy task as a member of the board to ask tenants, and we see hundreds and hundreds of tenants come to us in public testimony. So I'm very cognizant of the realities that tenants are facing. And ultimately, my hope is that we find better solutions to manage this. So I have a piece that just came up today with Vital City. One of the components of the piece is try to advocate for more programs to find a better balance of ensuring that low-income tenants are protected and capped in their rental expenses. My hope is that measures like these can help to shelter the poorest households from the consequences of rising rental burdens without defunding buildings, which can lead to really drastic and negative outcomes, as we've seen here in New York City in the past.
Right.
I have to say, though, there is one cost that at least the local government doesn't control, right? And that is the cost of debt for those, let's just call them for-profit owners who own rent-stabilized housing that are not regulated. Like it's really important that the rent-stabilized housing stock is not homogeneous in any way, shape, or form. And it's really important to recognize that. Because you need policy solutions that are crafted to the different aspects of the stock, if you will. But there are owners who bought rent stabilized properties in a low interest rate environment, but that has changed obviously over the years. And they may have bought it thinking, that the external circumstances were going to be very, very different, and they've changed. And in some cases, they may have over leveraged the properties, right? And now they're kind of stuck. And that's a whole different scenario. And a building that has a few rent stabilized units, but is mostly market rate, is very different than a building that is entirely rent stabilized with really low income tenants, you know. So our building that is, a lot of our rent stabilized buildings, are from 1920. They're 100 years old. They're a walk up. We have newer affordable housing as well, but like the needs are very different,
Yeah,
Oh yeah, I will. Go ahead, Howard.
I was just going to piggyback on that if I could, because I was talking with somebody recently and saying, describing describing the finances of rent stabilized buildings as a general proposition is, I said, is kind of like describing the circumstances of NBA basketball in New York as a general proposition. You can say it's great, it's been the greatest year ever, but you still have the Nets. Like there's, and I'm a Nets fan. I want to be clear, but the point is that rent stabilized housing is very, very far from being one thing. And Michelle pointed out, I think, the most important distinction, which is that there are buildings that are entirely stabilized, meaning that the building's income comes entirely from stabilized units. So when rents are capped or rents are frozen, those revenues are capped or frozen accordingly. Whereas you have another third or so of the rent stabilized stock is in buildings that are mostly market rate. And that puts those buildings and those units in a completely different financial circumstance. And when you look at the average of those two, you get a version of the, Bill Gates walks into a room and everyone's income on average goes up kind of issue. It doesn't change what's happening in the 100% affordable subsidized stock in the pre-1974 stock that is entirely or almost entirely still rent stabilized. That's where there need to be specific public policies targeted to address the revenue problem.
Can I just
Yeah, go ahead.
one thing on what Howard said? So I completely agree with his characterization that you have the two sets of the stock. And I think this kind of helps to shed some light on, I think, something many people are confused about, which is they hear from politicians and others, oh, profits went up 10% this year. Profits went up 6% this year. And I can totally see why, if you're a tenant and you hear, okay, my landlord's profits are going up 6%, 10%, what are they doing talking about further increases in rents when my building conditions are already so bad? Where is this money going? I completely understand the concern. But the reason for that, as Howard is saying, is that whatever, 6% profit increase, 10%, whatever it is year by year, is completely, an average of two totally opposite stocks and trajectories. It's that part of the rent stabilized stock, which is mixed into market rate units because of regulatory, kind of abatements, or because some units are deregulated over time. Those units are fine, and those buildings that those units are in are seeing record profits. The remaining part of the stock, that half of the stock that is 90% plus rent stabilized, they're seeing declining profits. They're seeing declining valuations. And so we absolutely need different tools and techniques to think about them. In my final city piece, which I'll mention again, I think a lot about how can we take more of the stock and have it look like the mixed stock in the first place. I think that makes for a much more resilient housing stock.
Yes, everyone should look at the article, the Vital City article that he's referring to. It's actually very good. I found it very helpful. But let's get into solutions. Let's go a little deeper into solutions. There are well over 100 people who are on this webinar. Many of them are journalists. The public discussion is happening right now. What are the best solutions that government should be aware of and considering, Michelle? What are the two or three things they should really try and focus on to kind of move the needle now that we have this new playing field with the 2-year freeze?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a couple things that impact affordability. Rental subsidy for eligible tenants is one. Obviously, only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for Section 8 receive Section 8 in our city, and more recently our state have, stepped up in terms of providing rental subsidy for eligible tenants, but the need far outstrips the supply, and there's a lot of concern that it could, create a huge hole in the city's budget. But that is one solution, like providing rental subsidy at scale for needy people. That's one. we also do workforce development and training programs. We train over 1,000 people a year and place them into living wage jobs. A big part of this is that people's wages have not kept up. And so, we need to be training people for the jobs of today and tomorrow, which of course there's lots of evolution on that right now. But we need to help increase people's incomes for sure. And then I'll speak specifically for those of us that own and manage affordable housing that's regulated. We're no longer in a low interest rate environment. And we need to really look at our underwriting. We need to, pay down some debt, if you will, and like release these properties from some of the debt obligations that they have, because it's the math ain't mathin', as they say.
Mm-hmm. Howard, give us some solutions.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll add to the list that Michelle started, which I think touches on the essential components of it. Well, I mean, one of them is there needs to be a coordinated or a concerted set of policies to keep costs down. And that is difficult in that it's a set of individual issues. So it includes things like trying to wrangle insurance rates through various types of reforms. Utility rates, water rate assistance for affordable housing is a thing that's been increased this year, but there's still a lot more need. And that's, DEP needs to pay the cost of operating the water system. They're facing a sort of a similar circumstance, but the operators of affordable housing don't have new revenues to pay higher water rates, right? Like that's just the way the math works. And then there are other ways in which, the administrative costs, which is one of the things that really pops out of the Community Preservation Corporation's analysis, the administrative costs of operating housing, whether it's navigating the code enforcement process, which can be cumbersome, it's important, but it can also be inefficient. And there have to be ways to sort of address the administrative costs of operating housing as well. I have two other categories that I want to touch on. I think that one of them is probably, and I'll admit candidly, I haven't yet read Arpit's piece, but so any alignment between what I say and that is, purely great minds thinking alike. But the taking the half of rent that is the tenant-facing half of rent and addressing that separately from the building revenue side of rent. In other words, looking at solutions that can reduce the tenant's responsibility for rent without reducing the flow of revenues to the building. So that includes things like, obviously the supply of Section 8 vouchers is not where we would like it to be right now. The federal government is not where we would like them to be right now. It includes things like city FEPs as well. The ability to help tenants pay the rent that's needed to keep the building operating is a really powerful thing. And obviously it's a very costly thing. So we have to figure out how to maximize the ability to deliver that. Then there are other programs that actually exist. I'll mention SCREE and DREE, the senior citizen and persons with disabilities rental increase exemption provisions. Basically, they are a rent freeze for people who qualify under these categories and with incomes below a certain level. The state legislature just expanded that eligibility for that program from $50,000 to $75,000 a year in income, which is great. But the idea of that program is, well, if we have populations, people who can't afford the rent increase, let's try to address their needs specifically without taking revenues away from the building. Because what those programs do is they issue a rent abatement credit to the landlord in the amount of the rent increase, as if the rent had increased, right, from a revenue standpoint, but the tenants don't pay that. So those kinds of solutions are the ones that I think we really need to look at. In the long run, though, as long as costs continue to fall further and further out of whack with the ability of people to pay for their rent, this is a problem that's only going to get worse.
Right. And Arpit, talk about some of the things in your article, because you really are on sort of a similar track where you're talking about more means testing, more sort of tightly focusing where subsidy and support goes, right?
Absolutely. So I talk about SCREE and DREE to make this distinction clear for all the listeners who might not be aware. So with programs such as housing vouchers, Section 8, that's going to cover, sort of the entirety of the rent for the tenant, but it's very costly as a result. And so it's a funded program, so people line up and we give out some vouchers, and then a lot of people are not able to get it. The city programs like SCREE and DREE cover the incremental increase. So it provides for stability. It means that households can program and think about what their rent is going to be in the future, and is a little bit lighter touch of an intervention by the city. And so I advocate that we expand the Screen 3 program by also considering a new program that helps all low-income New Yorkers, even if they're not elderly or disabled. So that I think is absolutely like one pillar of it, trying to protect the ability of the lowest income households in the city.
Yeah.
A couple others that I'll mention, we talked about the heterogeneities in the rent stabilized stock. I think the guidelines should also be tailored a little bit more, rather than one size fits all. So there are ways to do it. The way I personally like is to condition the rental guideline increases on building conditions. And this follows testimony I've heard from hundreds of tenants who have told me the exact same thing, which is that if you're a slumlord, you would get a rent freeze. Whereas if you're a housing operator that is operating your building well, you don't have violations, you're not eligible for the city's AEP program, which is intended to address the worst housing violators, there would be a different rental adjustment for you. This would, I think, do a few things that are really necessary, I think, to ensure the incentives are aligned for appropriate maintenance of buildings. You ensure that the worst actors are getting a worse deal than the people that are doing a better deal. But more importantly, you provide an incentive. Because now if you do the maintenance and you do the work, good for you, you should be doing it, but you're really not seeing a difference in your bottom line if you do the work and if you don't. And reality with rent stabilized housing is because there's a line out the door for how many people want to get in the unit, you can kind of get away with not doing the work and the remediation because the tenant is going to be stuck in place. So I think we need to address that by finding incentives to ensure that the building stock continues to be maintained. And I think separate guidelines that target building conditions would be one step to move in that direction. A third long-term trajectory I think we need to move in is to make more of the affordable housing stock look more like this mixed housing stock that we have. So I think we have a couple existing programs that kind of provide us a template for how to do that. We have city programs called Mix and Match, which ensure that you have different mixes of tenants within the building at different levels of ability to pay. We have new developments going on in NYCHA developments, for example, in Chelsea, which will combine market rate units and public housing units in the same complex. The reason and the idea I have is to try to make this happen for more of rent stabilized buildings. So how would that happen? You might have a rent stabilized building that has certain vacancies. Maybe we can find ways of turning those vacancies into closer to market rate in exchange for deeper affordability on some of the other vacant units in ways that preserve building level affordability but provide a little more flexibility for the owners. We could think about increasing building on rent stabilized properties and have those incremental units be market rate, which then provide the ballast and support to ensure that building conditions are improving for existing tenants. These kinds of solutions, I think, would be better socially because we know there's a lot of work that suggests that the integration of households is better in mixed income buildings, as well as financially, because the best way of making sure that these buildings are no longer so subject to what the RGP decides is that there's a separate source of revenue for these buildings coming from market rate tenants that cross-subsidizes and supports the lower income tenants. And if we had more buildings look like that, we could also have more rent freezes in the future because not all of the building revenue is therefore coming from the RGP.
Yeah, I like the part in your article where you almost talked about pairing it apartment by, within a building, you could pair a market rate and a subsidized apartment or a stabilized apartment. We have dozens of questions that are coming in. I want to urge people to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start reading off some of the questions, and we'll see how many of them we can work through. Here's a question from Ilan. He says, the mayor told us there's a city fund to help cover expenses if rents don't match expenses. Any idea what it is? The mayor has made reference to this. Let me ask you about that, Michelle. Do you know about this program?
I mean, I know for those of us that are owners of the regulated stock, it's part of this tools piece to help preserve existing affordable housing that's rent stabilized and under regulatory agreement. Howard may be aware of something broader, but that's what I'm aware of. And we're very eager to apply. And I understand things start next month.
And
Just
do you know about that, Howard? Yeah, there's some relief fund that every so often we report on how nobody has applied for it because apparently it doesn't quite match people's needs.
Yes, and I'm forgetting the name of the program. I think that was the idea for vacant apartments in need of upgrades, and the certain amount of money being. Yeah, that I'm not aware of the latest on that program. It was an effort to get at this issue of units that required some capital investment that that are otherwise going to just not return to the market, which is an outcome that I think nobody really wants to see. So that setting that aside, there's a broader set of tools. I want to emphasize one that's important, which is that the state recently reauthorized the J51 tax incentive program for the preservation of existing housing, sort of to finance the upgrade and preservation of existing buildings and rehabilitate them. And that's an important one. And the city council needs to, authorize that and get that up and running so that the city has that tool. At the same time, there's a point, we none of us wants to see the point where the issue of distress gets beyond where it can be dealt with on a building by building basis, right? If individual buildings come in and try to work out their finances with the city, that's great. But we have a lot of buildings, and there's about almost 500,000 in the pre-74 rent stabilized stock alone, and there's not going to be 400,000 preservation agreements. That at a certain point you have to figure out how to address some of these issues at scale, and not through building by building arrangements. And so I think that there's going to be a combination of tools in the toolkit that are going to be necessary to get there.
Here's a question about last night, so I'll direct this to you, Arpit. Why didn't we see multiple proposals last night like in past years? That's a question from Jay.
I mean, there was sort of a consensus among the other board members, I guess, about what the proposal that was to be passed, and so the board just moved ahead with that one.
Oh, okay. So, is the assumption that you have until next year to sort of see how all of this works, or are there sort of interim decisions that can be made by the board?
Yeah, we have a season. We start in sort of March, go through this final vote, and now we're done, and we'll meet back. The remaining board will meet back. Next year, and we'll see how it is.
Okay. This is a question from Adam Daly from AM New York. Christina Smith alleged in her resignation letter that the board's outcome was predetermined and that questions about the RGB's data and methodology went unanswered. Do you agree with any part of that criticism? And what was your understanding of whether the board weighed the cost data before last night's vote? Did Smith raise concerns internally before resigning? And did the board respond?
Is that for me? So, one thing I can say is that unlike in previous years, there was no interference that I observed by the mayoral administration on decisions of individuals. So I have to kind of give credit to the administration for respecting the independence of the board members. I also have to credit, of course, the professionalism and hardworking staff that provided excellent data and services for us to look at. So I think I kind of firmly stand on those two pieces, and I think as we discussed earlier with the mandate, how to interpret the mandate and how to think about it is really a matter of wide discretion that is left to the board. That being said, I kind of hear where Christina is coming from in the frustration of what are we going to do as a society, as a as a community, if we in fact have a board that is able to systematically set these rental adjustments through a freeze. So 1 year is one year's vote, but the mayor is, as you all know, ran a proposal for 4-year freezes. Are we going to continue to have a freeze 4 years regardless of cost considerations? I know everyone agrees, okay, well, we need costs to go down, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is the city faces fiscal constraints. If we do all the things that we're talking about here, property tax cuts, more vouchers, et cetera, that's going to take away resources from other parts of the government. So what is actually going to happen when the rubber hits the road, and what will future boards do if the cost considerations kind of remain elevated and the resources are not there? If are we going to? So And then how is Michelle going to underwrite her properties, right? If you're a lender now, what do you put down in your underwriting process for what rental adjustments will be in the future? So I think there are these real procedural questions about whether a body such as this that can be appointed by a mayoral appointee, and so even if there's no interference by the mayoral, on the appointees, if the appointees themselves are making decisions that will lead to these decisions and just make it very challenging for everyone to deal with, how are we gonna live with that? So I think that's an issue for for everyone to kind of cope with. But I definitely hope we find solutions to kind of move forward.
Errol, I know this wasn't the question, but I would be remiss if I didn't, say my 2 cents about urging us to get beyond the kind of gladiatorial spectacle of the Rent Guidelines Board and to the policy issues underlying it. And I think a lot of the things that Arpit just said gesture at that. The Rent Guidelines Board is not in a position to fix the affordability crisis. They just aren't. They have a mandate and they have to make a decision within the parameters they're given. And I wasn't there in the room, but so I can't comment on all the details. But that alone is never going to solve our affordability crisis. It's these other issues that we're talking about that have to be layered onto that. And so we obviously need to pay attention to the Rent Guidelines Board process and all that, but we shouldn't limit our imagination to the decisions that are before them.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, I hear what you're saying about the gladiatorial spectacle. I would just say I would love, I mean, and Fifth Avenue Committee and Neighbors Helping Neighbors, our affiliate, like we had tenants in the room. Like this was historic for them. Okay. They've been fighting for this. Again, this is impacting people's daily lives. I think what the RGB hearing process does is it helps make tangible to people like how public policy impacts their daily lives because they get to participate in that process every year. And it's like very understood how it works. I wish there were other democratic processes that were as well understood by everyday people about how they could impact public policy in their daily lives. Because like if we could take that energy and bottle it and bring it to Washington, I mean, and it's not like it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen on a consistent basis like it does for RGB. I think we would have dramatically different outcomes, right? And obviously, Tuesday's primary election, we saw some of that in action here in New York City, but we need to see that level of, civic engagement at like all levels all the time. It's hard to maintain, but that is really what we need in order to like address some of these other public policy needs that we're talking about, because really all it is about like political will and investment at scale, but that's only going to come with the pressure that we kind of see at RGB and like applying it to many other areas where people are suffering.
Speaking of democratic engagement, Michelle, one of the other conversations going on, you'd mentioned rental vouchers before. The city council is battling right now to try and finish up the budget. And one of the proposals on the table is to expand the city FEPS program to make sure that, maybe 20,000 odd more people might be able to get vouchers. Would that be of help to you, thinking of you more as a landlord than as an advocate?
Absolutely, it would. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have people that would be eligible that, but for the lack of additional resources are not receiving it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the budgetary question, Howard, of course, is that, city FEPS expanding at a rate of 4% a month. The cost of the program will double. It's 1.74, I think, billion right now. And, there are deficits that lie ahead if the expansion continues unchecked, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a budgetary question underlying all these things. And I think, there are trade-offs embedded in all of this. But finding the solutions, vouchers are a great example of it. The use of, the Section 8 vouchers that the federal government makes available is an incredibly powerful tool for aligning the interests of tenants and their landlords. Everyone wants that full rent to get paid and to keep the paperwork moving forward so that, you can recertify every year and be eligible. Those are really important areas of agreement, and the availability of those funding sources to support the revenues to buildings and the ability of people to stay securely in housing is a really, really powerful tool. I do think we do need to, for budgetary and other reasons, look at solutions like the screen and DREE idea, which Arpit, I'll say, we also recommended that same, expansion of screen and DREE to a category of lower income residents because it addresses that issue of stability in a less, it's not as helpful and not as powerful as rental vouchers, but it's a lot less costly and could perhaps be scaled more broadly. So looking at a balance of those kinds of tools is a really important piece of this.
Howard, was your organization on the record as for or against or wanting amendments to the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act? That the Apartment Association has pointed to this as a key piece of, basically, to explain it just a little bit for our audience, closing off some of the vacancy deregulation provisions that were already in place, that had long been in place. The Apartment Association and other landlord groups have said that really closed the door and made it impossible for a lot of units to even potentially become profitable.
In 2019, that precedes my presence in this organization, but my understanding is that I don't think we took a position on that. To be clear, we're not a landlord organization. We're a housing policy organization, sort of more broadly. That said, there clearly have been consequences of 2019 HSTPA that have created either unintended or untenable kind of consequences that really need to be addressed. I think there is embedded in all of these things this challenge of you need to really address both sides of the issue. Like one of the issues that exists that I think is an unfortunate consequence of a rent freeze or regulation of rents can be that, say you have a building that's full of a building that's populated by low-income seniors and a subsidized building for low-income seniors where everyone has a Section 8 voucher in order to make up the difference between what they can pay for rent and what it takes to operate that building, even with a subsidy. With a rent freeze, those tenants wouldn't pay an increase in rent no matter what, right? As long as we have enough vouchers to keep them in Section 8, they wouldn't pay for a rent increase if rents went up 2% or whatever they go up from year to year. The building would receive from the federal government 2% more for each of those apartments. With a rent freeze, you don't get that, right? Like those rents are frozen, but it's really only frozen effectively. I mean, it's already frozen for the tenants. Now we've frozen it for the buildings. And that is I think, a consequence of the kind of one size fits all shape of the rent laws and the way that they apply to all categories of housing. I think we need to be thinking creatively about how to sustain the revenues, particularly to those buildings, the ones that Michelle described earlier, that we spend billions of public dollars to create long-term, sustainable, affordable housing for people at low and moderate incomes. And we need to be partners in ensuring that continues.
I should mention Arpit Gupta, that is not a technical error. We knew we weren't going to have him for the full hour, so he had other appointments, and so we thank him for the time that he did spend with us. Michelle, do we need to be thinking as a city differently about all of this? I mean, what I keep hearing as a theme throughout this hour has been there's way more complexity than our current structure of determining affordable rent policy takes into account. And look, we have new digital tools. We have AI. That's the sort of the catch-all answer to almost everything. But we do have the ability to put a lot more nuance into our policy, don't we?
We do, and I'll just say, to the mayor's credit, the housing plan, block by block, it is, as the deputy mayor Leila Bozarg shares, like it's an all of the above approach. I think there's an acknowledgement that in order to build and preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing in the city, build 200,000 units and then preserve 200,000, that we will need multiple tools. I think the concern I have, I think we're clear on the need, right? We're all aligned on the ambition. It's like, do we have the funding to realize those needs and to address the ambition? And I think that's the biggest concern that I have. I think there's a lot of political will. I actually think there's actually quite a bit of alignment on like all of the above approach. I think there's a sense of urgency among those of us that already own and manage affordable housing and rent stabilized housing, that like we need the solutions yesterday. And we need like the solutions at scale, essentially. That's where there's not the alignment yet.
On the credit side, Michelle, some of the banks like Signature Bank, New York Community Bank, have voluntarily or involuntarily gotten out of the affordable housing lending business. Have other players stepped up? Is there a measure of relief or innovation in that area that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, I would say, I mean, obviously, CPC did step up, right, in acquiring the Signature portfolio. Uh, I mean, I would love to see like the philanthropic community come together with government to try to create a multi-billion-dollar fund that would provide a blended lower interest. So we could basically swap out some of our higher interest debt and our affordable housing properties for lower interest debt. But like at scale, like billions. That's what it's going to take. I think
what would that enable you to do?
I mean, it would do what I just said. You know, we have some mortgages, in affordable housing that we're paying, 6-7% in perm debt. If we could bring that down to, 4 or 5%, that would really improve cash flow and help us address the needs in the properties. I think that would be significant. I also think, I know we're getting into the weeds here and some people may, gloss over on this, but, the assumptions when Fifth Avenue Committee goes into the city of New York and says, okay, we want to build affordable housing, the assumptions are 95% rent collections a month, 90% occupancy, 2% annual increases in rent, or income, and then 3% annual increases in expenses. So we need to reset that to what the new norm is, based on
all of those numbers are fantasy world right now, right?
Exactly. So I'd like to deal with reality. I call myself a pragmatic, progressive. Let's achieve the same goals, but let's do it realistically together. Like let's hold hands together to achieve these goals. And so I think that's we really need to adjust those expectations in order to like realize the same vision.
What do you think, Howard?
I was just going to add to something that Michelle said about bringing solutions to scale, and I think one of the cautions that that is sort of shouting in my head is that we have so many segments of our housing stock that are going to be in need of some kind of assistance, and we can't forget that we have a long queue of obligations to address. We have our public housing stock, which we are part of the way through a massive generational reinvestment through the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, RAD, PACT, and the Preservation Trust of recapitalizing buildings that have been neglected for decades. And we can't shift any resources away from that. We have the Mitchell-Lama housing stock, which is actually, in many ways a cautionary tale for us, because you can look at in that stock and find many examples of buildings that had rents frozen for 7, 10, 12 years, and then faced massive rent increases at the end of that period that not only were, huge and dislocating for tenants, but are higher than what you would have needed if you were able to just sustain revenues along the way, because you had that accumulated disinvestment and those big capital needs that accrued. So we have that housing stock that we have to assist. We have the housing stock that Michelle is partly responsible for, that we have to assist. And then that doesn't even cover the privately owned the private unsubsidized rent stabilized stock. And so my concern is that when we create all the resources that we need to address those buildings that we have direct financial obligations to, as the sort of the government has direct obligations to as a financial partner on the housing. There's the private stock that also may require resources. And as you mentioned, private lending is not growing in that space. And that, when you have multiple years of a rent freeze, that makes the investment, the terms on which you're going to be able to secure a loan are going to be that much less favorable. And that's going to be challenging.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time. Seth is one of our folks watching who had a question about whether the conversation will be made available offline, and the answer is an enthusiastic yes. Just go to the Vital City site, and they'll have it posted there. I suspect there'll be a link to YouTube or something like that. But for now, I want to thank Michelle De La Uz and Howard Slatkin and Arpit Gupta for a great discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I think a lot of our viewers did as well. And we'll urge you to keep watching this space, meaning Vital City, for an ongoing conversation as we get closer and closer to a sustainable housing policy, which I think we all agree is something New York is in bad need of. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Errol.